Yeah, man. Across the hall from them. Okay, yeah. Oh, she's a killer. She's a killer.
Hello. Good evening, everyone. I'm Nathalie Cooke, and I'm delighted to be welcoming you. Just before we start, can I get a sound check at the back? Higher? Like that? Better? Bit louder for everyone in the front, right? I'm Associate Dean of McGill's Library, responsible for the ROAAr configuration of units. That's an acronym that describes 4 different rare and special collections units. R for rare books and special collections, O for the Osler Library of the History of Medicine, A for the Visual Art Collection, and AR for Archives and Records Management. For nearly 200 years, McGill libraries have been collecting, preserving, and publicizing the treasures from our past. We do this to inform and inspire ourselves, as well as our children and their children. Libraries think in very long terms. This means that our archives and collections are full of stories of yesteryear, and some of the most fascinating are actually profiled in our new book, which is going to launch and go on sale tomorrow. So, as well as in a number of items that ROAAr is going to be producing for sale. I have note cards here as an example. So please keep an eye out for the various products that we will be starting to move into the market. Like stories and memories, our collections are best enjoyed in the company of others. And that's why we've invited you here tonight to hear from Alexander Reford as part of our Remembrance Events series here at ROAAr. Thanks in part to the support of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and also to private donors, we're able to host these kinds of events right in the heart of our collection. But libraries of the 21st century are forward-looking as well as backward-looking. We foster discovery, collaborative knowledge building, and conversation. They're busy places, they're active, they're busting at the seams. And here at McGill, we're embarking on a very ambitious fundraising project to re-envision and redesign this library building. It's called Fiat Lux, Let There Be Light, and you'll find some information on your seats. But for now, today, I'm going to invite you to this particular space. This isn't our normal event space, but because of a fire in the McIntyre Medical Building this summer, we are actually using our event space to process some of the books because we're having to remove them and bring them into the building. So a couple of housekeeping points before we start. After the talk, we'll have a question and answer period. Our speaker is looking
anxious.
And this is going to be followed by a light reception. So at that point, we'll ask you to stick around, enjoy some of the works that are on display, and take that opportunity to speak to our speaker as well. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the mic over to Chris Lyons, who is head of Rare Books and Special Collections, and who at the end of the talk will be giving our forthcoming book and a collection of notepads to our speaker.
Oh, good evening. It's so nice to have you here. And welcome everyone. And it is a pleasure for me tonight to be here with you to share some of our treasures and to introduce to you, hang on, our wonky microphone. Is that better? Thank you. Okay, to introduce our speaker tonight, Mr. Alexander Reford. Now, Alexander is a historian with master's degrees from the University of Toronto and Oxford. 2 out of 3 ain't bad. You know, if someone were to give us a lot of money for our new library, I bet they would get an honorary degree from a real university. He was Dean of College at St. Michael's at the University of Toronto from 1987 to 1995. So being on our premises must be in itself a huge honor. After he took up the directorship of the Jardins de Métis, Reford Gardens, which were begun in 1926 by his great-grandmother, Elsie Reford, who began planting flowers on the family's fishing camp in Grand Métis, which is located on the lower north shore of Quebec in an area where many Anglo-Montrealers and others would spend their summers. Now, for over 30 years, his great-grandmother labored to develop one of the most beautiful gardens in the region, in that unforgiving climate and soil of the lower St. Lawrence, whom only Scots and tough French Canadians could grow anything out of. Now, in 1961, the Quebec government took over the gardens and opened them to the public. Now, one would think that the government's tendency to run things into the ground would be good in the case of a garden, but even in this case, it wasn't. So in 1995, Alexander came to the rescue and took over the gardens, and in the intervening years has turned them into a site of international repute with beautiful gardens, but then beautiful exhibitions and related activities to promote the nature and preserve the nature of the region. The most recent activity that Alexander has done is curating an exhibition now on display at the Chateau de Ramsey, and you see an example of it here. It's called War Flowers. Now, during the First World War, George Stephen Cantlie sent his baby daughter in Montreal pressed flowers picked from the garden fields and hedges of war-torn Europe. This exhibition looks at Cantlie's flowers through floriography, which is a word I didn't know until about 10 minutes ago. It's a Victorian method of communicating through flowers, and it's to consider human nature in times of war. This exhibition opened last year at the Gardens itself, and since then has traveled not only to Toronto, not only to the War Museum in Ottawa, but also to Vimy Ridge, the Canadian monument there, which, if you think of it, is a profound gesture to Canada's memory of the war and to this evocative exhibition. It runs until March 31st, so if you do, please have a chance to go, do go and see it, because it's very moving. Now, with no further ado, I'd like to introduce to you tonight's speaker, Alexander Reford.
Thank you so much. That was a very generous introduction. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. It's great to have you in this fabulous room. I do want to thank McGill for not only welcoming me today, but also displaying elements from their remarkable collection. I encourage you, after my talk, to view the exhibits, because they are illustrative, I think, of the very deep and interesting collections this institution has. Not maybe as big as the University of Toronto or Oxford, but I say that in jest. I seriously thought of coming to McGill, and I had my cousin who was a law professor, John Durnford, walk me through the campus, and I figured, I didn't want to, I grew up in Aylmer, Quebec, which is about 200 kilometers from here, and I simply wanted to move as far away from my parents as I could, and so Toronto was what I could afford at that point. So I ended up taking a different path and working at the University of Toronto. So it's great for me to be back in university environment. I spent some time here last week working in the Information Commons, where I was so struck by the energy of the institutional atmosphere. It was quite wonderful to be swarmed by students who seemed to be able to work in the most buzzing and noisy environments. Not the library that I remember as a student, but it was really invigorating to be back in the institutional world. So thank you very much for inviting me here today. I'm going to speak quickly because I got a lot of slides and I want to give you some information. but as Christopher mentioned, this is an exhibition that I invite you to go and see. It is at the Château Ramsey Museum, which is the beautiful historic house opposite the Hôtel de Ville. Don't take your car there, I can say from experience. It's a very expensive towing charge if you park in the wrong place. But it is a great little museum. Many of you probably haven't been there in decades, but this small, modest exhibition, which I'll show you slides of, is there until the 31st of March. We began this project about 2014, and we pitched the Molson Foundation, who were partners in the early phases of this project, saying, you know, in 2018 there'll be all kinds of exhibitions, and it'll be a big year for the 100th anniversary, and Montreal's going to celebrate, there'll be brass bands and parades. And of course, there aren't very many, frankly, because as you probably know, the First War in Quebec is a difficult subject, and we've always, frankly, walked through it, walking with great delicacy. You'll see why in a moment as I go through some of the slides. But we thought we would tell the story of the First War in a different way. It's not about the battles and the regiments, and it's not a regimental history. It's not really associated with many of the stories that you would know if you have ancestors who fought in that war. It really is an attempt on the part of the curator. I was the historical advisor, not the curator, but Viveka Melki, who was an immigrant to this country. She didn't know anything about the Canadian First War story, but she came from a part of Africa in which war is a common discussion, as it were, and part of her background. She was trying to understand, or trying to communicate the perils of war, the dangers of war, the experience of war, the emotions of war, the distance of war when a war is being fought a far away, the impact on the families and the children, and the ongoing impact of those battles on the families who then welcomed or not the returning soldiers home, and the impact that that experience had on these families. So it really is a different war story. It's not the kind of thing you would see if you went to the Canadian War Museum. There's a wonderful exhibition on now in the last 100 days of the First War. Go and see it. They do great things, but they really tell the story very much from the position of the military historians, who are brilliant and interesting people, but they have a tendency in an institutional fashion of telling these stories. This is a very different story, told in a very different way. As you'll see in this exhibition, the image here, there's a glass sculpture, there's some olfactory components where you actually smell not the flowers, not the flowers that are on display, but kind of the experiences. So you have leather and horses and urine and chloroform, and you have these various unusual perfumes that a perfumer has created essentially to illustrate some of the propositions or some of the elements that are displayed in this exhibition. So it's a very different exhibition. You can tour through it in a very short period of time. It's not voluminous. And it's not an attempt to tell the story of the war. It really is an attempt to bring you into the atmosphere of that war and maybe have you think a little bit about the First War and the experience that it had on many Montrealers. It is primarily a Montreal story, not exclusively. It is built around 10 historic figures: 2 women, 8 men, 2 French Canadians, 3 French Canadians, I guess, depending on how you view it. An artist, A.Y. Jackson. It attempts to tell stories from various points of view, and it does so in so-called stations, which is very almost like one of these bookcases here, in which you kind of enter an environment and then you think, hopefully, and connect to the story of the individual in the exhibition. So I'm going to speak about the exhibition and about the historic personages and about my family's experience with the war, and hopefully entertain you sufficiently to encourage you to have some questions at the end. And so the exhibition is called War Flowers in English, and in French it's called Fleurs d'Armes. And this is the starting image of George Stephen Cantlie, the fellow you see on the left, who was really the starting point of this exhibition. He was the Cantlie Hotel, you probably know it, it's on Sherbrooke Street here, that's where the Cantlie house was situated. The Cantlies are an old Montreal family, old in the sense that they came here in the 19th century. Scottish merchants, they established here in Montreal, and Cantlie was second generation Montrealer. His father was in the textile business, and he was a member of the militia from the age of 14. So he was what you would call politely today, I suppose, a weekend warrior. He had been involved in the Montreal militia from a very young age, and then when war broke out in 1914, at age 48, he led the Black Watch of Montreal to the European conflagration. So he was an older soldier, not unusual, but fairly senior in the military apparatus. And at age 50, he was pulled off the front because there's a lot of ageism, as you probably know, in the military situation. They thought a guy at 50 too old to be at the battlefront, so he was pulled back, and he then trained soldiers from the United Kingdom to go over and replenish, and they use that word, replenish the Black Watch, who had had serious losses in the course of 1916 through 1918. So here's a very good image of Cantlie. He was associated with the regiment for 72 years, so probably a record. As you probably saw in the news this week, Black Watch unveiled their Victoria Cross. They pulled it out of the vaults at the Royal Bank, and they're now at Mons, I think, leading a kind of a recreation of the liberation of Mons. So Black Watch, very much an old Montreal regiment. As you may know, the story of the militia in Montreal is important. These were regiments of volunteers who gave their time to associate themselves with the military, but it was also a bit of a private club. It was not dissimilar from the Montreal Athletic Association. The militia was a place that you went if you were a man to exercise, to parlay with your colleagues, to drink perhaps occasionally, to share a meal. And so it was very much part of the Scottish milieu to associate yourself with that regiment, and Cantlie was very deeply involved, as I mentioned, with that regiment from a very young age. Cantlie was an older soldier, so he had 5 children that he left behind in Montreal. He went to, he was in England when the war was declared. He came back to Canada, led the regiment over in 1915, and then fought his first battle at the Somme in 1916. During his time at the front, he sent letters home on a regular basis to his wife and to his 5 children. And so this exhibition begins with this discovery by Elspeth Angus, or my colleague, Bianca of Elspeth. Some of you may have known her. She just died recently, and earlier in the summer. She was a member of the Angus family, a distinguished old Montreal family as well. And she was a bit of a hoarder, I can say that I think kindly, and she kept a lot of family history, including the letters of her grandfather, Mr. Cantlie, that she saved from her cousin Celia, who I think was about to discard them, and she said not to be discarded, they're vitally important, we've got to keep them. And those letters are a wonderful collection. They're not perhaps as interesting as some of these fascinating letters that you have here, because these are full of content. His letters are letters written to a 4-year-old child, so they're fairly infantile in their language, but in each letter he collected, harvested, and sent beautiful flowers that he collected from the battlefields of France and Belgium. So it was an emotional effort, I think, on his part to try and connect to a child that he maybe thought he would never see, because of course the rate of death already by 1916 was very high. And he wanted his children to have some connection to their foes. I think it was also an attempt on his part to continue a conversation, and also illustrative, I think, a fairly common phenomenon in the battlefields where these men, as you can see, these extraordinary images of battlefields mostly destitute of life. But as you know, the poppy that is part of Macrae's poem is that the churning of the soil in the French West, the parts of France where the Canadians were mostly stationed, the sort of clay, fairly ugly part of France, frankly, flat, if you wander the streets of Montreal today, that kind of cool, damp temperature, which is somewhat omnipresent. Well, as the munitions churned the soil, the first plant to restart, to rekindle, to emerge was the poppy. So the poppy was quite common, but it's one of many flowers that Cantlie, you can see in this image here, sent home. This is one of the poppies that he sent home to his 4-year-old daughter. Celia Cantlie's grandson, by the way, is a fellow named Eric Molson. So very connected to the Montreal business milieu. His name, George Stephen Cantlie, comes from George Stephen. You may know that guy. He had a big house here on Drummond Street, who was the founder and first president of the CPR. So one of the reasons why I think Cantlie was a weekend warrior is because he was an accountant with the CPR. Now, I have nothing against the CPR, but I think being an accountant for a railway, according to his own family, wasn't the most exciting work you can imagine. And so the military for him was an outlet which created, I think, a more interesting and vibrant life, which I think explains one of the reasons why he was so anxious to get over. There you see a great photograph of 3 generations of the Cantlies. They were a military family. There were generations. In fact, George Stephen's Cantlie's brother led one of the regiments from Winnipeg, so there were a number of generations of Cantlies who've been in the Canadian military. And you can see here this wonderful Scottish regalia that was part of their get-up. So Cantlie is sort of the focus, or the starting point of this exhibition, but he's not the only personage that we discover, but he's part of that Scottish tradition and that important element of Montreal society at the turn of the century and in 1914. So in the exhibition, you'll see a number of beautiful works by an artist, Mark Rains Roberts, who is a Toronto-based glass artist, and his job was to try and distill, encapsulate, transform, evoke the story of the war, and to do so in glass. This is a huge amount of work, as you can imagine. This is all, each of those little elements is a sort of a prick of a machine on this crystal glass. It took him many, many weeks of work, and the narrative that he created is quite moving in and of itself. And of course, one of the elements of the exhibition is to create a kind of a light in the darkness. There's a lot of interplay of light and dark. The building itself is quite dark, and of course these beautifully illuminated sculptures bring the story to light quite literally. So if you enter the exhibition, this is the show as it was at the War Museum in Ottawa. It was at the Gardens, it was at the Vimy new Memorial Centre in Vimy this last summer, where it was seen by over 100,000 people. So do go to the museum and enjoy it. It's a lovely place in any case, and the exhibition will be there until the end of March. So it's a combination of imagery, flowers, framed flowers, photographs that are archivally interesting, and then depictions of a number of the characters. So we chose 10 people. You know, as you probably know, there were 660-some thousand Canadians who were engaged in the war effort from 1914 to 1918. There were 60 to 68,000 Canadians who were killed, either in battle or of their wounds. That's a significant number. There are 69,000 Canadians in the Canadian Armed Forces today. So there are more Canadians killed in the First War, almost equivalent to the number that are currently serving. Of course, the Canadian population was quite modest in 1914, 1918. It was a smallish country. And the enrollment in the English-speaking population of Montreal was quite high. As you probably know, there's a lot of debate over the participation of the various communities in the First War. But one of the truths is a lot of these soldiers, both in Montreal and particularly outside of Montreal, who went to fight, were in fact British born. They were born in the UK and they went to fight for their mother country. There's a lot of discussion as to the rates of volunteerism, because of course in 1917 the conscription becomes so-called necessary, and that creates a whole different debate in society as to who should go and who should stay. Why didn't you go to begin with? And we'll get to that in a moment as I go through some of the photographs. So we chose 10 figures. A.Y. Jackson to the left. A.Y. Jackson, of course, a famous painter. He enrolls as a soldier. And of course, the First War is a lot of luck, or bad luck. In the case of Jackson, he got lucky because he was wounded. Not seriously, but wounded enough to be pulled off the front, and he goes back as a war painter. So if a war painter, you go back, none of the war painters to my knowledge were killed in the First War. They were able to observe, but from a healthy distance. And of course, Jackson's work, if you know it, you'll see all these wonderfully disarticulated, naked trees that are very much part of his Canadian landscapes. Well, if you look at the images of the war environments that he was painting, you see trees without leaves, without branches, and you can kind of see how this, I think, at any rate, impacted his ongoing interest. But Jackson, of course, was an interesting figure because he was one of the many Canadian artists that Max Aitken, Lord Beaverbrook, later created this extraordinary documentary heritage that we now have, which is mostly because of Aitken's brilliance to go and document the war through artists and through journalism. Center guy, you probably know, George Vanier. There's a metro station in his name. I think every province has at least a dozen high schools to take his name. He was, of course, Canada's Governor-General. Canada's Governor-General towards the end of his life. He died in office in 1967. But before that, he was a Loyola-educated lawyer. He founded the Royal 22nd Regiment. He went over as a youngish man, and he became the poster boy for French-speaking participation in the war effort. He had what was called a good war. He came back alive, but he came back with a degree of a kind of a halo of perfection that followed him through the rest of his life. He lost his leg. And in fact, one of the interesting stories that my connection to Vanier is that the person who operated upon Vanier, and he's probably photographed in one of these albums here, was a guy named Dr. Louis Reford, who was a surgeon with the McGill number 3 health medical unit, and he his claim to fame, if he had one, was to have amputated George Vanier's leg. Vanier did say, he saved my life, but this was not uncommon, but he became, as you may remember Vanier, some in the room, he became a kind of illustrative of a man who believed that duty was significant. And I think he's probably the only McGill family to have husband and wife who got honorary doctorates, and I think, I'm sure their son, Jean Vanier, who's a kind of living saint, has probably also got one. Anyway, Vanier, on the right, Ted Savage, Edward Savage. These fellows all survived the war, but Savage was killed by the influenza epidemic in 1919. So he was a late victim of the war, but he came back alive and left a significant heritage. He's got this wonderful documentary heritage of over 300 or 400 letters to his wife, who was back in Montreal. So these are three of the figures. These two fellows, probably well known to you. On the right, Percival Molson, a good-looking guy who left his legacy to McGill. I think it was unattributed, but McGill decided at that point they wanted the stadium instead of a library, which is kind of too bad for you. But he was a star athlete. I think he's still thought to be McGill's best athlete ever. I think his running boots are on display. He was an Olympic athlete. He played, multi-sport. Good-looking fellow. And he died, as did his good friend Talbot Papineau, in their 30s in France. So these are two fellows who did not survive the war, and their stories are illustrative of this kind of commitment, this notion of duty, this desire to serve. And I think a rather sad tale in both cases, both men without families. In Molson's case, he took a bullet through the mouth, through the jaw. So he had a perforation that the bullet went in one side and out the other and took most of his teeth out. And a fellow named Arte McKenzie, whose sculpture you see as you come into the library, was the surgeon who helped to reconstruct his face. So Molson went from being arguably the best looking man in Montreal to having this sort of fake artificial appendage that accompanied him, and he could have stayed back, but he, as did Papineau, volunteered to go forward in the big push towards the end of the war, and they were both killed. So Papineau, who was thought to be the kind of Pierre Trudeau of the 1914 to 18 period, he was going to unite Canada, French, English. Papineau, of course, descendant of the famous Louis Joseph. He spoke English and French perfectly. He was the first Rhodes Scholar from Quebec, graduate of McGill, lawyer, bon vivant, bright, and he was thought to be the future of Canada. And so there's a lot of very interesting material about, and you probably have a lot of it in this archive here, as to these tragic episodes of the kind of future of Canada being left on the battlefields of France and Europe. John McCrae, you know his story. This is a great photograph. He loved animals, both horses and dogs. And of course, McCrae, like many other surgeons, were back from the front, but they were killed not by the howitzers and the guns, but by exhaustion. In his case, he died of pneumonia, which was not uncommon affliction for those who were working with the number 3 McGill unit. Two women. It was important to have women. Women did not serve in the First War, but they were very close and very active. And the two women that we chose for this exhibition, one was Julia Drummond on the left, and the one on the right is my great-grandmother, Elsie Reford. They were close collaborators. They were a generation apart almost. Julia Drummond was born in 1861, and Elsie was in 1872. Drummond from a very successful marriage. Her husband was Sir George Drummond, who was the president of the Bank of Montreal. Fairly well off, but one of the first, I guess, prototypical feminists in the city. She was very active with the Montreal Council of Women. She sort of began to push women's health, and then the crazy idea that maybe women should get a vote. And so she was one of those women who was pushing that agenda quite aggressively. And one of her colleagues in that effort was Elsie Reford, who, and they together founded something called the Women's Canadian Club of Montreal, which was the first sort of public institution in which women could actually come to a talk like this and listen to a man speak to them, because in previous eras the women could not hear any of the speechifying that was going on in the city. The men would go and the women would hear about it afterwards. And they thought this was absurd and unfair, and why can't we have access to the great thinkers of the day? So they created a club for women only, and occasionally they would invite men to attend, which is very generous of them. So these are the figures. The 10th is a guy named Jean Briand. You probably know him because he's got a street near the University of Montreal. Jean Briand was one of 2 French Canadians to win the Victoria Cross in the First War. which is a very important recognition of bravery. And if you read the citation for Briand, his bravery is so exceptional that you kind of wonder how it's even humanly possible. He took bullet after bullet after bullet, and he went forward and got more bullets. Finally, he succumbed from his wounds. But Briand is from my region, so it's one of the reasons why we included him. His brother, Jules Briand, became a very successful businessman. He created a giant empire, but Jean was the younger son who volunteered and at a fairly late stage in the war. He's a telegraph operator who was lower in the officer grade, but became a Victoria Cross, which, as you know, was given to people for bravery of all sorts. It wasn't reserved for the officer class, whereas the Military Cross was given for only those who were officers. There were a number of bravery medals that were reserved to those who were at higher grades, but the Victoria Cross was simply given for courage beyond the realm of possibility. So those are the 10 figures that you can explore in the exhibition, and they're brief texts, and there's some wonderful images. And bring your Kleenex or your handkerchief, because it's quite an emotional experience if you kind of enter the experience of trying to understand their story and their reality. Can you hear me in the back, by the way? Oh, I didn't. Sorry. So some quick photographs of the exhibition. So, as Christopher was saying, there is this notion of florography. So one of the elements of the exhibition is to try and connect the flower to the symbol, the human to the human attribute. It's sort of based on a Victorian, you probably know the Victorian literature is full of virtue and this sort of associative language that of course then becomes quite common in the war poets of the First War. Many of them are quite fabulous, where they often play with these same virtues and actually, I think, overturn them. The notion of duty and courage, and they begin to question whether these are actually values or not pernicious ones that have led these extraordinary men to their precipitous deaths because of bad generalship and bad politics. Because, as you know, the First War was really a catastrophic diplomatic error in which these secret treaties between certain countries and publicly accessible ones led these countries to a conflagration that, of course, ended with 4 empires collapsing and millions of deaths, both civilian and in service. So it really was a catastrophic event, and I think the war poets really do very effectively, in a way that was not possible in the journalistic press, to sort of discuss and present the reasons why the war was an absurd event in human history. So you can wander through the exhibition and hopefully come out with a greater sense of Montreal at war. Some of these stations do explore this more completely. As I mentioned, in Quebec we have this wonderfully complex society, and I think the First War is wonderfully illustrative of that complexity. I think it's a great historical gift. I know it's a difficult legacy for us all to deal with as a collective, but I think it is, if you look at the newspapers of the period, if you look at the documents, if you look at the discourse, I think it is a very good example of how a human conflagration can be seen very differently by different peoples depending on their vantage points. And my great-grandmother was deeply involved in that. She stepped into this public mud with a bit of naivete and a great deal of energy. And so she was a Montrealer who went to war, quite literally, and I'll show you in a moment. She crossed the Atlantic in 1915. And she did so because her son was in service. So she had 2 sons. The eldest son, my grandfather Bruce, joined the army in 1914. He was summering in Métis. War breaks out in August. He rushes up to Montreal, takes a ship across the Atlantic so that he can be first in line. So one forgets the enthusiasm. There was a great deal of anticipation. The war was on the horizon since July of 1914. And then, of course, they had this naive notion that they had to get there, otherwise they'd miss it all, right? So they all rushed over if they were remotely inclined, like my grandfather. He went over in September 1914 to join a regiment. He was a student at Oxford University, and he wanted to get there first so that he could be at the front as soon as possible. Wonderfully naive, but there is this common, and if you read any of the literature, of course, I'm sure McGill has accessioned about 100 books in the last month, because the First War has become a bit of an industry. There's a lot of fascinating books that have come out in the last number of months. And then in 1919, Elsie Reford goes back to those same places, returns to Europe and goes to visit the battlefields of Europe as part of a battlefield tour. So the Black Watch is there today doing exactly what she did in 1919. It was a very common phenomenon. In fact, if your husband was killed or your son was killed, then you often went to the battlefield to try and understand it, to see the places, to mourn, to see the early cemeteries, of course. It was important to see the gravesite. And these are photographs that my great-grandfather took in 1919. And there you see her in a kind of a black costume in front of a cross that was commemorating some of the Canadian soldiers who were killed. And this is what they saw. So if you go to France and Belgium today, you'll see these remarkably reconstructed cathedrals and the town hall of Ypres and so on and so forth, immaculately redone in 20th century cement. But they're all recreations of these completely devastated cities that were mostly destroyed between 1914 and 1918. And if you went, you would take a Michelin guide that would help you wander the battlefields of Europe. There were a whole number of guides produced in both English and French that allowed you. I'm sure this institution has a number of them. They're quite fascinating documents because they were literally designed to assist those mourning. You can see the images, as I mentioned, the A.Y. Jackson trees. You see the kind of vegetation, the devastation. So quite fascinating documents in and of themselves. And I'm sure there are a number of diaries in this institution and elsewhere that you could view. We happen to have a wonderful album of these really tragically devastated cities and these, frankly, mostly starving people beginning to recreate their lives at the end of 1918 and 1919. So my great-grandmother went across, and she was not alone. Julie Drummond also moved to London for the duration of the war. If you're a woman of means and your husband was an older man, you often actually moved your household from Montreal to London. So Mrs. Cantlie did the very same thing. You wanted to be close to the action. You wanted to be able to help. You wanted to be able to be there when your husband was on leave. Maybe they weren't quite sure what they would do if they weren't there. I think there was a bit of that. But I think they were also wanting to be present to give them succor and assistance. Because, of course, leave was an ongoing, there was a lot of movement, of course, back and forth across the channel. You would get sort of 8 days of leave, and you would come to London. You get 1 day traveling there and back, and then you get 5 or 6 days of leave. And in Cantlie's case, he was able to go to his uncle's fabulous country house in the country and spend a couple of days riding the horse that he also sent over from Montreal. So these were, of course, wealthy people who were able to enjoy war in different ways than the average soldier. But they were also experienced, as you know, the First War was a very egalitarian exercise. People were killed irrespective of their rank, and in fact, the officer class were often. And certainly in the English regiments, the number of officers killed was highly disproportionate because of their foolhardy and rather minimalist. The pictures of the man holding a pistol as he goes over the trench, not very intelligent soldier, and frankly, because he were basically standing up to get shot. My grandfather was 6'6", and the fact that he survived is a bit of a miracle, and I think it's mostly because he got, as I say, he was a lucky soldier. He got wounded at the right moment, so he was pulled out and was recuperating when all the battles in which his regiment were decimated were happening. And then he was made part of the military intelligence, which some have always joked is a bit of a contradiction in terms, but if you're military intelligence, you were at general headquarters, so you were often far behind the lines and you were moved forward once the battles had reached their conclusion as opposed to being there. So he was fortunate in his service. So I'll skip these. I just want to this is a kind of an amusing anecdote. My great-grandmother, these are dog tags. So every soldier, of course, got a dog tag that looked like this, and they were made from asbestos because the rate of incineration was quite high. It's an odd and sad thing to think of, but you wanted to have the soldiers survive with something, so they made these things out of a fire-resistant material so that you could at least find the charred remains of the corpse. And so these are very interesting objects of which you can now, frankly, find a great many on eBay. We had terrible trouble, frankly, convincing our museum partners to lend us historical objects for the exhibition because we were doing them in 2 historic houses and in non-traditional museum environments like the Vinnie Interpretation Center. And so we ended up not borrowing anything from the Royal 22nd or the McCord and so on. We ended up buying most of the objects that you see in the exhibition on eBay. There were, as you probably can imagine, there are many, many soldiers, and a lot of this material is now available. It's kind of tragic, but you can buy everything from medals to munitions. And one of the more common ones are these dog tags. We did get taken once because we bought a dog tag for a soldier that we thought was a Vancouver soldier that we were going to used in some way, and it turned out to be a dog tag for a dog. So sometimes eBay isn't all that precise in their identification. But this is sort of an interesting object in and of itself. But my family were from a fairly well-off milieu. They lived not too far away from here on Drummond Street. And my grandfather was given a silver dog tag just to accompany his standard issue one. And you can see this is the one that he was given by his parents. The objective, of course, was to, you can see in the center C of V, each soldier would have had an identification as to what religion he belonged to, so that the right padre would bury him in the right manner. They were all buried in an egalitarian fashion. There were no religious cemeteries. The Commonwealth Graves Commission has no religion. You'll see Jews next to Anglicans and Roman Catholics, and sometimes you'll see some of the ciphers on their gravestones, but they were all given the right burial rights in the appropriate church. How am I doing for time, Christopher? Okay. The other reason why Elsie went over was because her brother was deeply involved. So she is perhaps not unusual. I think Montreal was a bit of a village at that point, and if you were in service, you knew somebody in service. The Black Watch, of course, was a regimental family, but Montreal, the Anglophone community, certainly in that milieu, was a fairly small community. A lot of intermarriage. The gene pool was quite limited. And in this case, my great-grandmother went over because her brother was serving as well, and his name was Frank Meehan, and he was the commanding officer of the Royal Montreal Regiment. So here you have two first cousins, both commanding regiments from Montreal, going over and leading regiments from the 1914 to 1918 period. There's a wonderful period poster here. The military posters from the First War are quite wonderful. Sometimes a bit offensive. The sort of recruiting messaging is quite brazen. In this case, it's fairly modest. But you see a special regiment of picked men from Ontario and Quebec. I'm not quite sure what the message is behind picked men, but there's clearly a messaging in this early language of recruiting. That armory is the one I think you use. You come along Dorchester, I guess, approaching Westmount. Am I right saying that? Yeah.
No, that's not the armory. No, I think it's the one on Les Moines, because that's where the Grenadier Guards are now.
Okay, then you're right. And this is an equally interesting photograph. So this is brother Frank Meehan, and you see he was involved in the flour milling business. And of course, one of the wonderful aspects of the First War is the press becomes very engaged in the process, and you have people like Henri Bourassa, who was the founder and editor of the Videography, who was a very aggressive anti-imperialist right from the get-go, and his language, of course, is quite fascinating to read. And then on the other hand, you've got the Star and the more aggressive Anglophone newspapers having completely opposing positions on most issues. But occasionally you get these wonderful cartoons, like here you see Frank Meehan, who, while he was at war, his flour milling company in Montreal called Lake of the Woods Flour Milling, you know, 5 Roses that flashes up in the port of Montreal, that was his company. And you see here Frank Meehan, general, is also gorging himself on money because his company is making vast sums of money by selling flour to the Canadian military that's being sent over. So there is this wonderful cartoon literature, and I think that's one of the interesting aspects that can be explored. Cantlie I mentioned at length, so I'll skip him. This is the Black Watch marching into battle in 1917. This is some of Cantlie's memorabilia. This was sold at auction a couple years ago. So Elsie's husband was also in the war effort, but one of the interesting aspects of her story is that in 1915 she goes over to be near her son, and then she gets stuck there. Why is that? Because the Lusitania is torpedoed. So nobody wants to come back and get torpedoed, so she ends up staying in London really until the end of 1916. And when she comes back from London, she gives a number of speeches to the women of Montreal, displaying or discussing or presenting, as it were, the experience that she had had in London. And I'm just going to read you a short excerpt because I think it's quite interesting. This is a speech she gave in September of 1916. So imagine yourself, the Women's Canadian Club of Montreal. You're probably all like-minded people, all pre-dressed up for the occasion. And here you have this woman who's just come back from the front, i.e. London, and she's telling you about her experience at the war. And she's doing so in a way that she thinks is different from the messaging that they were getting in the newspapers at the time. And she ends her speech in a fairly rousing cry to participate. A few weeks ago, the leaders of a great political party addressed an immense gathering in our city. At this moment, critical but pregnant with great opportunities for Canada, the speech of the evening opened with a stirring reminder of the unexampled prosperity and riches which the Canadian people had received at the hands of a long administration. True, the speech went on to include an academic discussion on war in general, on German barbarism and atrocities in particular, and a very strong stand against so-called militarism which might arise in England after the war. While to the vital question of the hour, the speaker devoted a few sentences to asking a branch of the community to do as much as their fellow citizens for the honor of the French name. Was there one ringing call to his fellow Canadians of every race and language to rally to their flag, to share in its defense, in its victories and its glories, and to avenge that barbarism he denounced? No. Was there one single warm word of appreciation of Great Britain's marvelous efforts to maintain our shores and our commerce inviolate and to protect the liberties of mankind? No. Was there any glowing tribute paid to the memory of those young Canadians, French and English, who have known how to die gloriously? No. And to that audience, said to have been the largest ever drawn together in Montreal, was there in any of the speeches any pointing to the higher motives in life of to give and to serve rather than to get and to take? I could not find it. And this at a time when the world is being drenched in blood, bowed down by the weight of sorrow, but exalted by the heroism of man. Pretty tough language, but this is a woman who's trying to instill in the community in which she's a part a greater devotion to duty. She's also kind of doing what McGill is doing, which is raising money, because part of the first war was to raise money for the Canadian Patriotic Fund, to send funds over to buy war bonds, because of course we were financing the war by borrowing vast sums of money. But she did this routinely over the number of speeches until she walked into this giant mud pit of French-Canadian animosity, because she used the word, and we have the speech that we just found recently and transcribed. She wrote a very long speech that she addressed, and obviously somebody in the room was there to record it. In that era, the Gazette would basically print verbatim a lot of speeches, or she may have given them the text. In any case, in her speech, she goes through and she calls out what she initially calls shirkers, and then she crosses that out and uses the word in a speech called slackers. Well, a slacker in 1916 was a very loaded term because, of course, you're accusing a whole community of not contributing. And she then gets accused by all kinds of different people, mostly liberal, capital L, elected politicians, for using language which is completely inappropriate. She's also doing this at a time because her cousin is a guy named Arthur Meehan. Arthur Meehan was the Solicitor General in the government of Sir Robert Borden, and his job with Borden as Solicitor General was to pilot a bill called the Conscription Bill through the House of Commons, which was trying to enforce obligatory service on the part of every man over a certain age. So she was walking into this political minefield. She doesn't really draw back from it, but at a certain point, intelligently, she stops making these very public speeches. But it does illustrate the kind of degree of commitment in this community of Montrealers, of which she was an exemplar. Her husband, at the same time, was running a shipping company. And this is a piece that we just found recently. This is a rather wonderful, I think, PR exercise where the company, the Robert Reford Company, which is a shipping agency, did this photograph where they had a display of all the workers who were then involved in the war effort in some way. And it ends, you probably can't read the text, but it's quite amusing at the very end, because at the very end it talks about the drummer boy who's enrolled, it talks about Colonel Gear who's active with the militia, it talks about the various staff who've gone, and then at the end it says, how far the feeling has gone in this office that everyone should be doing something to help out in the present international crisis is shown by the fact that even the majority of the women employed in the office have enrolled with the Corps, which has been drilling in the Ritz-Carlton Hotel recently. So I kind of amused to think of the Ritz-Carlton becoming a kind of parade ground, but this sort of need to commit, because need to be shown to committing, I think was very much part of the Montreal story of that era. So I can see you getting fidgeting here. So I've got some, it's a great story, and frankly this story could be told in a 26-part PBS series. Montreal at War, by the way, there's a wonderful new book that has just come out. It is an online book, so it's free. It's written by a historian named Terry Cooke from Wilfrid Laurier University, who has done a very interesting and detailed portrayal of Montreal from the time war is declared until the very end. And I think he's done a masterful job of pulling together some really disparate information. And if you have family members who served, you can actually go and see they pulled together in the index the regimental list. So you can actually see every man who served, the date that they that they join and become active in service. There's some wonderful information, some detailed notes, some extraordinarily interesting photographs. Terry Kopp, it's called MontrealAtWar.ca, and it's available free of charge. I hope it comes out as a book. I'm one of those guys who actually likes physical books, so I'm very grateful for the gift to be given one, because I do think this is the kind of memory project that deserves a permanent iteration. And it is a wonderful story that needs to be told more fully. I can go on forever, but I think I might stop, and I'm not sure where I am with time, but do I have any?
You can close up, 5 more minutes is fine, and then we'll go.
All right, okay. Well, I want to tell you this, maybe the most tragic story. It's the one that brings tears to my eyes, so if I tear up, my apologies. The saddest story that I have, Percival Molson's is very sad, but he had no children, he was unmarried. He loses his face, his beauty is gone, and he goes back willingly to get killed. Talbot Papp, tragic story, but equally, no children, no wife. The hope of Canada was snuffed out in his death, and McGill mourned. He was a famous figure here. He was going to be the darling of the Montreal society. He was going to unite Canada. He was going to kind of be a new Wilfrid Laurier, but he was a conservative, so Montrealers liked that, because he would unify the French and the English, and he would do so in ways that were going to be they were going to provide sort of independence for Canada at the same time as we would be part of the imperial family, which of course was very important for the city in particular. The saddest story, of course, is that of Julia Drummond. I mentioned her earlier. Why is it sad? Well, because Julia Drummond was blessed with misfortune. So she married a clergyman who died shortly after they were married. She marries a second time, George Drummond, very successful businessman, much older than he is. They have one child who dies shortly after birth. And there's a fabulously sad photograph in the McGill archive of this infant child photographed after its death. She then becomes very active in the women's movement, as I mentioned. She becomes a real leader in progressing Montreal society, English and French, to a new place where women would have a greater place, where women's health would be important, where we would nourish children, irrespective of whether we were Catholic or French. She was very involved in the playgrounds movement, which was designed to create playgrounds, schools, because a lot of the Roman Catholic schools here had no play spaces. They were just institutions with no playgrounds. So she was very active in that movement to kind of green the city. She was progressive. She was conservative, but in a very kind of liberal fashion, if you can understand that dichotomy. And she has one son, whose name is Guy. And Guy is a graduate of McGill, 6'4", super handsome. He is thought to be the richest soldier killed in the First War. His will is probated in 1918, and he was worth over $1 million. Guy Drummond is killed very early in the war, so 1915. The Montrealers really begin to see action only in 1915, and he's killed quite early. And he is killed in a very tragic fashion. He is fluent in English and French. He went to Sorbonne after finishing in McGill. So he's highly educated. In fact, there's some wonderful testimonials to him by some very important French political figures, because he was known to be open and welcoming, and he was a good conversationalist, and you can sort of see him as being the kind of darling of the milieu in which she was living. He had married in the spring before the war commenced, so he's married in April. He goes over like many others, and then he sits, like a lot of Canadian soldiers. They sort of sit on near Stonehenge on Salisbury Plain in the mud for a number of months, because the Canadians aren't thought to be good enough soldiers to go over in the first wave, because the first wave, of course, the professional soldiers, and then they get desperate to get new recruits, so they send all these untrained men, and Guy Drummond is part of that second crew who goes over in the spring. He is killed. He takes a bullet or a shell because he's standing up to try and encourage those who were fleeing the first gas attack, these French soldiers, North Africans, primarily Moroccans, who were fleeing the gas. They had no idea what this was, and he was waving madly to them to encourage them to take solace in his trench in French. So he becomes a kind of poster boy of the Canadian ideal soldier, because frankly most Canadian officers could not speak French. So we had a problem already in 1914 and 15 in the Canadian military of not having enough bilingualism. That story played out many, many decades later, but Guy Drummond stood up and was waving these French soldiers to calm their ardor, trying to understand what's going on, and he is killed. the morning that he was killed, he attended the funeral service of his brother-in-law. So his wife's brother was killed the week before, and he attends his funeral that morning. So in the afternoon, he's killed himself. So you can imagine the story of Mrs. Drummond and the father of these two women. They've lost two sons-in-law in the space of a week. Then the third daughter, his name was Braithwaite, he was the Toronto manager of the Bank of Montreal. Third daughter goes to bring succor to her two sisters, and she goes down in Lusitania. So three sisters die within a month. And the sort of sad story in the Toronto newspapers of Mr. Braithwaite, who was sort of literally unplugged, as you can imagine, by this event. So Julie Drummond is interesting because she takes this sort of despair and turns it into a very positive contribution. So she is blessed with a son who is fabulous, who was sadly killed, and then she commits the next 3 years of her life to creating basically the Canadian Red Cross as a functioning unit in London, and something called the Maple Leaf Club, which was this place to which all the Canadian officers could go to get R&R in a fairly controlled environment by these women who believed that the soldiers needed some rest before they went back to their death or hopefully to succeed in battle. So Julia Drummond is a very interesting case of a woman who's completely committed, but I think I've got a couple of photographs here. But you can see in these images this kind of deep sadness. It's really exceptional. She was photographed in London a number of times during the First War. And in each image you can kind of see how more drawn and sad and despairing. Her husband had died, so she loses two husbands, two sons, but she becomes essentially, she's the first woman to get a doctorate, apparently from McGill University. Couldn't tell you what year, but she became kind of an icon of female commitment to the country, which is, I think, an interesting exemplar of kind of the notion of duty and responsibility. So the war was devastating, it was demoralizing, it was disastrous, but it also brought out, in some cases, the best in a number of people, and this is a good example of that. So I've taken enough of your time today. Thank you so much for coming. I do encourage you to go and see.
Before we invite Professor Eli MacLaren to come up to give our closing remarks, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about our collections. And I want to do that because it's a way of me to extend to you an invitation, which is an invitation to use this material. We're a public institution. Our collections were built, and it's interesting to say it in this context, amongst our collections, our great collections, are a collection of First World War pamphlets. And from what we can tell, these were contributed to the library by Montrealers after the war. So at the time, someone realized we need to document this stuff, and we need to collect it, and we need to do it now before things get tossed out and lost. And so this collection was put together, and we just recently cataloged it, so it's accessible that way. But it's just one of many collections we have, both published material and archival material. And what we tried to do in this exhibition, in telling a story, is to expose you to this. This is just the smallest of slivers from our collection. But if you start at the first case, we are trying to evoke the feelings at the beginning of the war. So part of it is from our children's book collection. There are daring deeds of British airmen, and there are things like that. There are Canadians in khaki, and of course you have a jolly Canadian soldier with his girlfriend or his wife. In contrast, some of the art put out against the Germans, you have Germans, murderous Germans murdering Europe, or in play. And then children's books. We have a great children's book collection. One of them is a trope on a German children's story called Stumpfe Peter, who you might have read with his typical Germanic joie de vivre, has a guy going around cutting kids' thumbs off because they suck their thumbs and everything. But in using it in this case as a way of playing, ridiculing the Kaiser. So fun and games gets carried over to recruiting posters, to the 148th, which was a unit made up largely of McGill people. And, you know, will you be the next man to put the eye in fight? These give you a sense of recruitment. And there's another one which is wonderful, which has a mirror saying, you know, This man is wanted by the 148th, and you look at it, of course, and that man is you. Well, I know it's not me because I'm 52, and the war is long over, but others. We have a collection of war posters of the First and Second World War, some of which are digitized and online, so those are small examples of that. Then we start getting into the reality of the war. One of them is an image of photographs which were circulated at the time. We don't quite know their story. It's a company, Underwood and Underwood. We had a collection of about 150 of these, and they have captions. We suspect these were used to promote recruitment or bond drives, and were probably put in local places, run in newspapers, and they were circulated that way. So you're starting to see the reality of the war, that's the public face, and the private face. There is this amazing collection which we really need to get out there and digitize and everything like that, put together by a man named Robert Fenshaw, spelled Featherstone, who you may have seen because he's written a number of books on Montrealers in the First World War. A book on McGill at War, 1914, 1918, 1939, 1945, and a history of the No. 3 Canadian General Hospital, which was a McGill General Hospital, 1,400 beds established behind the lines, of which people like John McCrae was chief of medicine. So he collected wonderful material, including, he must have done this in the 20s, there borrowed letters and diaries from people, because of course these were meaningful for families. So he would borrow them, type them up, and give them back the original. So we have all these wonderful accounts of nursing sisters in Macedonia, of soldiers at the front, so Montrealers and all these people, in their own words, talking about their experiences. And like you said, you get a much different feeling for the war. This extends into, I think, one of the most iconic things in our collection, which is John McCrae, as we said, was associated with the No. 3 Canadian General Hospital. He was not trained at McGill at the University of Toronto, but we made an exception and let him train and do his residency at McGill, and he became quite established in the Montreal hospital system, teaching at McGill. And when the war started, he was very much a Kipling-esque character. He had fought in the Boer War in the artillery. He had joined the military right away. He wanted to fight. He saw himself as a fighting man. The reality of the war really starts to wear at him, to the point where this super patriotic John Bull becomes this sad, discouraged, sick, weak individual who succumbs to pneumonia and dies in 1918. In 1915, he writes a poem, In Flanders Fields, that captures both his patriotic side and the real horror of the war simultaneously. We have two copies of it in our collection. One, his own written copy, which is right here in the case, which he wrote. He wrote it out several times for different people. But we also have what we think to be the earliest known recording of it. It was published in December 1915 in Punch, the humorous magazine. We have a nurse's diary, a woman named Claire Gass, who was with the No. 3 Canadian Hospital, who in October of that year writes out the poem. So I suspect she either had a handwritten copy or John McCrae dictated it to her or something like that. So we have that too. And in amongst with her with her diary are these pressed flowers, which you'll see on display there. We have the poppy becoming the symbol of the sacrifice, and we have this Victory Bond poster in 1980, and already it becomes an illustration. And then we have the remembrance of the war. We have the large headline history of the Great War, these scrapbooks that Fenshaw kept for both the First and Second World War. But each one's about this big, that thick, and there are several of them for each of the wars. So we have that here. And then we have the memorialization of the war. We have the windows, that stained glass window that Percy Nobbs designed, which you can see in the Strathcona building on the second floor landing, this beautiful memorial to the sacrifices, including McCrae, who's remembered in that, and with poppies. And those are the original drawings done by Percy Nobbs, who's some of his furniture that he designed, you'll see around here as well, and Blackadder, of the Blackadder Lawbreaker, who was killed as well. And our final thing on exhibition is our Book of Remembrance, which is the names of all the soldiers who were killed in service in the First and Second World War. That's digitized as well, so you can see that online. And next week, it will be featured, I believe, by my colleague, the University Archivist, in Memorial Hall, which will be open for the first time in goodness knows how long, in the Curry Gym, for us to remember the centenary of the war. So I invite you to see the exhibition, which will be up for the next few weeks, but then to do all the research you want here. Just please, we're so happy to have this material, and so we're happy to share it with you out of nothing other than your curiosity. And if you have things from your family and your background, and you do want to know that they'll be remembered, and maybe someday, 100 years from now, somebody sitting in this room or audience, and hopefully another room, because we'll have built a new library, will get to hear about your family story as well. So thank you, and I'd like to now invite Professor MacLaren to come up to say a few closing remarks, and then refreshments.
Thank you, Chris. Well, it's often said that Canada came of age as a nation in the First World War. It's a common story. It's reflected in Canadian literature, which is what I teach. We see it in what we saw in paintings of A.Y. Jackson tonight. Went on to be a great Canadian painter. Much of his nationalism comes out of this event. We see it in our great writers. Nathalie mentioned Ellen Montgomery of Ingleside. The Great War is also in Ralph Connor's remarkable autobiography, which is perhaps the best book that he wrote, not fiction, but non-fiction, about his work as a chaplain in the First World War. I was just teaching Margaret Lawrence's Diviners this afternoon. The Great War is in that novel, and indeed the ladies from hell figure in it with their kilts. The protagonist's father saves a man from certain death. It's also the conscription crisis in Hugh MacLennan's novel Two Solitudes. So really, Canada's coming of age in the Great War is really reflected in our literature. But it's not their stories that I want to remark on now. It's the remarkable story that Alexander Reford has told us through his exhibition. It's the quality of a good storyteller to address an old truth through new details. And I think that's what we experienced here this evening. Some of those details that stuck out to me were Colonel George Stephen Cantlie writing to his four-year-old child and trying to refract his experiences for that audience. How can you write the experience of the war to a 4-year-old? Or Percival Molson, star athlete, Olympian, who takes a bullet through the mouth and then returns to service and is killed. Julia Drummond's portrait, which Alexander ended with, I think is probably the most inspiring detail here. And it's something that we should all probably take away from this talk for Remembrance Week, and that is this story of turning despair into an ideal of service. And I'm really touched and moved by that detail. So thank you, Alexander Reford. Thank you, Chris and Rare Books, for putting on this wonderful event.